She screamed that cripples don't belong in community pools, then heaved my wheelchair into the deep end like it was beach trash. The metal vanished with a hollow splash, while parents yanked their kids away from me as if being disabled were contagious. And the woman who did it? Yeah, she was the HOA president. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just lay on that sun-hot concrete and watched her smug little sandals click away to a rented cabana like she'd done the neighborhood a public service. What she didn't know, what nobody around that pool knew, was that I'm a civil rights attorney who lives and breathes the ADA, and that chair was suddenly worth more to me on the bottom of that pool than it had ever been sitting under me on land. Let me back up a sec because you're probably wondering how we got to Wheelchair Meets Cannonball. 2 months earlier, I'd moved into Willow Ridge, the kind of beige suburb where you submit a paint chip to change your garden hose, but it was close to rehab and the listing bragged about ramps, curb cuts, and an accessible pool. So I signed hopeful, still stitched up from surgery number 6, trying to figure out a life that included metal and wheels. And if I'm honest, more stubbornness than sense. First day at the pool, I felt the stares, not hostile exactly. Just that brittle curiosity people wear when life reminds them it can go sideways. You know what I mean? Then she appeared, Meredith Cole, 50s, sun hat big enough to shade the county rhinestone spelling pool royalty across a swimsuit like a threat smile stretched tight as plastic wrap. I'm the HOA president. You can call me Meredith, she said, but the way she glanced at my chair told me what she really meant was, we don't do this here. When I gestured toward the pool lift, she leaned in and murmured, family-friendly environment. It's unsettling, like I was a jump scare instead of a neighbor. The next morning, a violation landed in my mailbox for non-regulation pool equipment, which was cute considering the equipment was the HOA's own lift. I replied with chapter and verse federal law, attached the regulation like party confetti, and figured that would settle it. It didn't. A few days later, I'd rolled to the lift, unbuckled, ready to slide into water, and maybe into a version of myself that felt normal again, when Meredith stormed across the deck yelling about liability and sanitation and special needs shouldn't trump common sense, her words not mine. I said we could call the HOA attorney together and discuss the ADA like adults. Her answer was 30 pounds of titanium skidding toward the deep end. I let myself slip to the rail, watched the chair arc into the blue, listened to the gasp ripple around the pool, and said nothing. When security showed, when a lifeguard hovered and someone muttered, "Is she allowed to do that?" I explained calmly that they'd just witnessed felony assault and a federal civil rights violation. But I didn't press charges yet. I told the officers I'd handle it civilly, and Meredith smirked like I'd surrendered. What I meant by civilly was a methodical kind of vengeance, letterhead, vengeance, subpoena, vengeance, receipts, and binder's vengeance. I kept every notice recorded, every meeting filed, public records requests until the copy machine wheezed. I lodged a formal complaint with HUD's Fair Housing Office, then called an old classmate, Cal Rivers, who now dismantled HOAs for sport. And because I know how power hides when it smells trouble, I looped in a journalist friend, Lena, who covers disability rights. The story landed with a splash bigger than my chair. HOA president tosses wheelchair photo of me smiling, while the chair glimmered at the bottom, and Meredith shouted in the background like a villain caught mid-monologue. Yeah, that happened. Meredith went to ground, sent her assistant, a 20-something polo statue named Ty, to deliver a printed sorry for any misunderstandings card that read like a condolence for a houseplant. The HOA called an emergency meeting. I rolled in with a loaner chair, sleek black, shamelessly Batmobile, and sat front row. Meredith tried to barrel through the agenda. I cited page and paragraph of the bylaws giving residents the right to speak. Her vice president, Rick, the kind of man who's been hiding on golf courses since 1999, coughed and said, "She's right." I placed a thick folder on the table and walked them through every bogus citation cross-referenced with ADA standards, then told them copies had already gone to HUD. I suggested immediate corrective action beginning with President Cole's resignation. Meredith made a noise like someone had swallowed a pine cone. And that was before Cal walked in and handed her a letter notice of intent to sue for $500,000 discrimination and harassment and the whole alphabet of federal acronyms. She responded the only way petty power knows how, death by paper cut. I got 3 new violations in a week. My solar garden lights were excessive, my ramp unsightly medical equipment, my doorbell camera aesthetic disharmony. Ty hand-delivered each one. I thanked him and photographed him holding them, then slipped them into the binder. Here's the thing about bullies. They keep creating evidence because they don't know how not to. A neighbor, quiet, sharp-eyed, goes by. Ruth texted me after overhearing Meredith on the phone during backyard wine hour, panicking about missing financial records and pool upgrades that never happened. Ruth sent me a little audio she'd recorded, and I had to replay it because Meredith actually said she'd used HOA money for her kitchen remodel. We subpoenaed the books. Meredith's lawyer suddenly needed a vacation. The board suspended her pending internal review, which is HOA for we're in trouble. Then came the first settlement offer, $75,000, and an apology note, ADA policies updated by Christmas. I countered with $1 million immediate resignation, mandatory training, and a public statement, no lipstick for this pig. They balked. I smiled. Lena's follow-up story sharpened its teeth. Disability groups amplified it, and the neighborhood's threadbare tolerance for petty rule gods started to rip. Then Ty called Cal and flipped whistleblower immunity in exchange for emails, texts, board notes. I wasn't expecting that twist, but there it was. Meredith calling me the lawyer, joking about timing violations to pressure me to move, bragging that she'd coded bathroom invoices as ADA upgrades. 2 board members resigned by lunch. Rick sounded like a ghost when he asked, "What will make this go away?" The real implosion arrived with the forensic audit HUD's team, and the insurer's bean counters cross-checked 5 years of spending and found nearly $300,000 in vapor. The treasurer, Paula Simmons Cardigan Queen Lemon Bar Saint, had been cutting checks to her son's landscape company for work that existed only in a spreadsheet. Meredith approved community enrichment that looked suspiciously like marble countertops. The town hall was standing room only. Rick stammered about breach of trust. Paula hid in the back. And then Cal stood and introduced himself, not as my counsel, but as lead attorney representing multiple residents in a potential class action. Someone dropped their phone. The HOA blinked hard at the abyss and came back with a real offer, $1 million no NDA, immediate ADA upgrades, with an external compliance officer and a full board turnover. I signed on my porch while a notary stamped and an interim president handed me a formal apology with all the enthusiasm of a man chewing tinfoil. Money's a tool. Use it or it owns you. I peeled off $50,000 to a local disability rights group, $25,000 to the community pool shade canopy's new lift ramp with sane slope. And I made sure every improvement carried a plaque naming exactly what had forced it, because transparency isn't revenge, it's prevention. Meredith's house went on the market, her Lexus collected pollen, and the Facebook group shifted from pearl clutching to potlucks. The new president, Denise, retired nurse takes no nonsense, caught me at the mailbox and said the part out loud. "Thank you for ripping off the Band-Aid." She asked if I'd consider joining the board. I laughed until my ribs complained, then realized sometimes the guardrail becomes the road. I said yes. The vote was unanimous. My nameplate reads Director of Accessibility and Compliance, long enough to make anyone think twice before picking a fight. And yes, at the first meeting I wore a t-shirt that said ADA all day, brought cookies shaped like tiny wheelchairs. Half the room laughed, half the room winced. That's progress. Now you'd think credits roll, money-wired apology signed. Villain exit stage left. Real life prefers loose ends and back doors. 2 weeks later, the county showed up clipboards and squints, curious about my ramp, setbacks, my solar permits, my backyard shed. I've seen this move the grudge outsourced to bureaucracy. I asked who complained. They hedged. I explained federal oversight and retaliation law in a voice that says I can and will sue before lunch. 5 minutes later, I had the answer. Tip came from a firm that wrote our old bylaws, the same one that enabled Meredith's reign. Cute. They found nothing illegal and left with a new respect for the difference between annoyed and liable. If the settlement changed anything in me, it wasn't the bank balance. It was the throttle. I formed Access Forge, a nonprofit that gives people what I had, lawyers a playbook, courage wrapped in paperwork. By month's end, we had 100 inquiries, almost half from within 20 miles, because Meredith wasn't a disease, she was a symptom. We filed for a woman in Fairmeadow, fined for handrails. She needed to walk from her car, and for a dad whose kid with CP got banned from the clubhouse elevator for safety. Same recipe, document, pressure, federal teeth when needed, media when useful. A movement doesn't have to be loud to be unstoppable. It just has to be relentless and right. Ty resurfaced too, not as an errand boy, but as a human being trying to outrun his choices. He called awkward and shaky, said he'd spiraled after everything blew up, that he'd stayed with Meredith because fear felt like safety. Said watching me hold ground had rewired something he thought was permanent. He was taking night classes in public administration, wanted to help. We met for coffee. He looked lighter, no polo, no panic. I told him what I tell anyone who asks, own it, fix it, keep going. He volunteers with Access Forge now, quiet, steady, the kind of redemption story I don't put in press releases, because not everything needs an audience to count. And there was Paula, the treasurer with the lemon bars, who mailed me a letter in small, shaky script. No excuses, just a confession that greed had hollowed her out, that she hoped I'd do more good with the truth than she ever did with silence. I framed it not as a trophy, but a compass. You either build the world you can live in, or you build the one that will bury someone else. The best proof we were building the right one came on a hot Saturday when I rolled back to the pool just to see it. New ramp, glinted, lift, hummed, shade stretched wide enough for comfort and conversation. A little girl crouched on the concrete, drawing with chalk stick figure with wheels and a cape, and under it she wrote in wobbling letters, "Welcome, hero." I took a photo not for evidence, not for the story, just for me. People recognize me now. Grocery store nods, mobility scooter, fist bump, selfie request while I'm chasing almond milk. It's sweet and weird, and sometimes I just want spinach, but I get it. When you've been treated like an inconvenience, seeing someone push back without flinching does something chemical to your hope. I spoke to first-year law students last week. Topic: disability rights in private communities, and opened with a simple question. What do you do when the law says you're allowed, but the people in power say you're not welcome? Hands went up. Sue, protest, document, be louder than their comfort. Exactly. I told them the real story, the heat of the deck, the weight of silence, heavier than water, the way power looks away until you pin it to the wall with facts. One student followed me out, said she'd been afraid to ask for accommodations, didn't want to be that person. I said, make waves, just don't drown in them, and if they try to pull you under, call me. You know what I mean. I never recovered the old chair. Sure, we drained the pool and hauled up the frame, but the electronics were toast. I kept the front wheel, mounted it on my office wall, a clean circle of metal that reminds me not of anger, but of trajectory. Meredith wrote me once more pages of perfume-soaked grievance about how I didn't beat her. I embarrassed her. That last line was the truest thing she ever put to paper. Because this was never about beating one person, it was about stripping borrowed authority away from anyone who thinks a title is a permission slip to be cruel. The miracle was never the million, it was the hinge when a community stops pretending that aesthetics is neutral and admits it can be a costume for exclusion, when a board that's always been a fortress turns into a service desk, when the sign by the pool doesn't read rules first, but access matters. That's the story. So here's where I leave you, at least for now, me under a new canopy. Water lifting light into 100 small diamonds, kids cannonballing while my chair waits at the edge like a promise instead of a trespass, a neighborhood that isn't perfect but isn't pretending either. It's a tidy ending if you squint, but life hates tidy, and I'm okay with that. Loose ends keep us honest. Tell me this, though. When is accountability justice? And when does it start to feel like revenge? And who gets to decide which is which? Drop your line in the water, was I right? To push it as hard as I did, should I have settled sooner? Or is this exactly how communities change? I want to hear your take on right and wrong, on power and restraint, on how we live together without stepping on each other just because we can. You've heard my story now, tell me yours.